In the waning days of the Victorian era, 20 years after the passage of the Comstock Act, people were fed up. Comstock's legal definition of obscenity included contraception, abortion, sexual toys, even medical or scholarly information related to human sexuality and reproduction. Police confiscated all kinds of materials, no matter how benign, in raids they usually didn't want any part of. Rubber goods were often in the stashes. So at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the most popular building in the White City was on Cairo Street, located on the Midway Plaisance, a mile-long bazaar of all nations, with exotic sights like men wearing turbans and fezzes, and women performing belly dances with bare midriffs. Ida Craddock was, as Rebecca Davis wrote, enraptured by the belly dancers, as were millions of other visitors to the bazaar. It was all a giant middle finger to Comstock, who stormed out of the place ready to shut it down. But he couldn't shut it down. It was too popular, and all that sexual expression and Orientalism made a lot of money. In his 50-year career as self-appointed public prude, Anthony Comstock made a lot of enemies, but he really hated Ida Craddock. She wasn't super well known in her time and certainly hasn't been broadly remembered by historians, but her influence was huge. She was raised a quiet Quaker, but as an adult became an outspoken Unitarian. Davis describes her as a free love mystic. She called herself a student of phallic antiquities. I love that expression. She traveled the country with a suitcase full of research and exhibits that included printed information, photos, drawings, and sculptures, most of which were of a very, shall we say, personal size. And these things were all illegal under the Comstock Act. It was a time when decent Protestant women of even modest means would join the Women's Christian Temperance Union, including many prominent Unitarians like Frances Willard, Mary Livermore, and Fanny Farmer. Yes, that Fanny Farmer. The Temperance Union started off as an organization that promoted abstinence from alcohol in order to prevent drunken violence against women and children in the streets and in their own homes. And over time, the union expanded to include causes of women's suffrage and access to contraception. But by 1890, the union was emerging as a force of purity among women and was officially horrified by the Cairo Street Bazaar. They were as horrified as Anthony Comstock was. It was a time when women would publicly shame other women about how to be a woman, all with the intention of making women safer. I guess you could say those days were a lot like today. To understand Ida Craddock, though, you have to go back to 1882 when she was 25 years old and making a living teaching stenography, when she tried to become the first female student at the University of Pennsylvania. Now, she passed the grueling 4-day entrance exam, but was denied admission because she was a woman. Determined to continue her studies, she wrote a draft of a book on sex worship in earlier times, in which she elevated cultures that were labeled backward or primitive by the legitimate anthropologists of the day who bestowed primacy on Anglo-Saxons. She called those earlier cultures more intelligent and progressive than the Western society in which she lived. Over the years, she published books and pamphlets with names like Spiritual Joys, Letter to a Prospective Bride, The Wedding Night, Right Marital Living, and my personal favorite, heavenly bridegrooms. She earned a reputation as an expert. She would speak to audiences all over the country, wherever they were bold enough to defy the law and host her. Her audiences were mostly men, but often there were women present, sometimes large numbers of women, which would raise the ire of the public. Often it was women themselves who were outraged, as they considered it profoundly unladylike to be in mixed company discussing anything remotely connected to sexuality or reproduction. Most people called her a nutcase. The thing is, though, she was pretty odd, even by the standards of 21st century Unitarian Universalists. She never married, yet she presented and referred to herself as Mrs. Craddock. The honorific gave her the respectability of a married woman during a time when a 25-year-old single female was referred to derogatorily as an old maid. But the honorific also gave her authority on sexuality during a time when sex was supposed to be only for married people. Remember that Professor Davis called her a mystic? Actually, Mrs. Craddock was a spiritualist. Spiritualism is a belief that living humans can communicate with the dead, and that the dead can provide guidance on ethical and moral issues. The spiritualist movement was born in the 19th century during the Third Great Awakening that I talked about last Sunday, and it was very popular by the end of the 19th century. Many Unitarians and Universalists were also spiritualists, even if they kept it quiet within the walls of their congregation. In fact, the congregation that my dear husband served in Ohio was offered an enormous endowment by a member, local industrialist Jephthah Wade, on the proviso that the congregation call a spiritualist minister. The congregation refused, and the gift was denied. Spiritualists weren't, and probably still are not, very mainstream. But it wasn't just that she claimed spiritualism that made people call Ida Craddock a nutcase. It was the fact that she claimed her personal experience and authority came from what she described as an ecstatic communion with a spiritual husband. My husband, she explained, is in the world beyond the grave and has been for many years previous to our union, which took place in 1892. She wasn't getting ethical advice. She wasn't just getting ethical advice from this spirit. She was having sex with him, apparently great sex with him. She'd been with her spiritual husband for a year before she saw the belly dancers at Cairo Street. So by that point, she was pretty experienced and pretty open-minded. Free lovers, liberals who eschewed monogamy and often lived in utopian communities that were springing up all over the country, embraced her as one of their own. And even they thought that she was a little too out there. But she persisted. Oh, how she persisted. In 1898, Mrs. Craddock was arrested for selling copies of a pamphlet she wrote, which instructed husbands on how to satisfy their wives completely. And she was released after paying a fine. A year later, she was arrested again for distributing a similarly themed pamphlet under a different title. This being her second offense, she needed a lawyer and secured none other than defender of free speech Clarence Darrow of Scope's Monkey Trial fame. He even paid her $500 bail, which was a huge amount of money back then. She was released on the condition that she burn every single copy of the offending literature. The third time she was arrested, she refused to plead guilty and ended up being convicted and sent to Blackwell's workhouse for 3 months. In 1902, the indefatigable Mrs. Craddock had, for quite a while at that point, been on the most wanted list of Anthony Craddock. who came to see her as a personal enemy. With 3 deputies, he raided her tiny New York City apartment, arrested her, and she was quickly convicted of indecency by a jury of 12 men. What could she have written that was so awful, you might ask? Well, she encouraged men and women to take their time, to enjoy heterosexual lovemaking in the context of marriage, lingering in the pleasure. She suggested making it last 30 minutes, preferably 60. It was unthinkable talking about such things, suggesting that sex should be pleasurable. So she was sentenced to 5 years of hard labor. At the age of 45, she saw that as a life sentence. So the day before she was scheduled to report, Ida Craddock closed the windows and doors of that tiny apartment, sealed all of the cracks, and turned on the gas. Her body was found the next day with a note saying that she had dreamed of a world without Anthony Comstock and without corrupt judges. The irony is that the kind of sexuality Ida Craddock encouraged wasn't any different from what the Pilgrims had encouraged 270 years earlier. It's largely forgotten now, but according to Professor Davis, the Puritans talked about sex all the time. They were pro-sex as long as it was heterosexual and sanctified through the covenant of marriage. They weren't even all that uptight about it. People engaged in queer sex all the time and even moved away to live their lives as another gender, behaviors that were politely ignored as benign, so long as they didn't attract too much attention. The Puritans even let their kids sleep together before marriage. They called the act bundling, which I love. And adults figured that if the kids were going to be doing that kind of thing, they were going to do it no matter what, they may as well let them. They figured, the walls in the houses weren't very thin, so everyone in the house would hear it if the play became too rough or non-consensual. And if it resulted in pregnancy, well, at least they knew who the father was and a wedding could happen quickly. But in less than 3 centuries, the pendulum had swung so far to the right that sexuality the Puritans thought was normal and healthy was criminalized. But the pendulum did swing back. Within a decade of Ida Craddock's suicide, anarchist author Emma Goldman and Unitarian nurse Margaret Sanger, motivated by the gumption of Ida Craddock, would put themselves at the forefront of legalizing contraception and teaching about healthy reproduction. And within 70 years of Craddock's death, Roe versus Wade would make abortion legal in all 50 states. And now we're here. Abortion is illegal in too many states. An unrepentant misogynist is about to be inaugurated. And misogyny is so normal that some of its loudest perpetrators are women who've internalized the patriarchy. I'm thinking of last May when Georgia Republican Marjorie Taylor Greene and Texas Democrat Jasmine Crockett verbally sparred, very publicly sparred. After Ms. Crockett spoke, Mrs. Greene suggested that her colleague was having a hard time understanding because of her fake eyelashes, which were clouding her vision. Ms. Crockett responded by saying that her colleague has a bleach blonde, bad-built butch body. I was telling all of this to a colleague last night, by the way, who taught me a new term: toxic femininity. There's a lot there to unpack. In a world where some men are claiming that rape isn't real and saying things like "your body, my choice," and a lot of cisgender gay and straight people hating on trans and non-binary folks, this is what we have in political leadership. That's why, to me, most of the time, it feels like we're headed backwards again, like the pendulum has swung in the other direction, and that Anthony Comstock has been reincarnated into a whole bunch of different bodies. When I was growing up in the time of liberation of women, gay men, and lesbians, there was room for so much. Women were redefining their roles in the family, workplace, and community. White queer people were kicking open closet doors and claiming their place in communities. Unisex fashion was cool. Men and women were wearing bell bottoms and silk shirts. David Bowie, Boy George, Grace Jones were all pushing the boundaries of how we could present ourselves. Even transsexuals were becoming mainstream. It seems to me that the need to define two genders, and two genders only, so narrowly, is one of the harshest symptoms of monogamy. For anyone assigned male at birth to be anything but a man is a fate worse than death to misogynists. It's a pox on masculinity. Of course, with each step forward, there's pushback from traditionalists. In the last 60 years, women's lib has been blamed for the downfall of civilization, and now anyone on the outside of the gender binary is taking the blame and the violence. Ida Craddock dreamed of a world without Anthony Comstock and corrupt judges. A world without a few people I could name would be great. But what I really dream of is a world where nobody is threatened by misogyny, transphobia, and plain old prudishness, that they felt like they have no choice but to end their own lives. Maybe, just maybe, if we keep our minds open and stop calling each other names, we can get there. Please rise now in body or in spirit and open your gray hymnal to number 108 so that we can sing together My Life Flows On, an endless song.